This lecture focuses on plant roots, as well as modified shoots and roots, most of which are below ground and serve a storage function. So we will start by talking about roots. We will go over their function, as well as their morphology or shape. Next, we'll talk about those modified shoots and roots. We'll discuss bulbs, which are shoots with leaves that are modified for storage. Then we will talk about two kinds of modified stems. These include tubers and rhizomes. We'll also talk a little bit about stolons. We will mention tendrils and succulents, and end by talking about storage roots and some final thoughts. There are several functions of roots. I'm going to focus on 5 that I think are particularly important. The first is that they anchor the plant in place. This is true of almost all roots, but it is particularly obvious for something like these mangroves, which have roots that come out from fairly far up on the stem and stick widely out to the sides. As you can see, the mangroves are growing in a swampy environment. The muck at the bottom of the water is not very stable, so to help stabilize the plants, they grow these roots that go particularly far out from the plant. A second function of roots is to absorb water. And what I want you to notice in this photograph, or this sketch rather, of prairie plants, is that the roots in fact are going quite deep. In this particular illustration, they're going down between 5 and 8 feet deep. But we now know that there are prairie plants whose roots go down several meters. Contrast that to how tall the plants themselves are, which is only about 2 feet tall, and you can see that the root system, in fact, is much deeper than the plants are tall. This is also true in agricultural plants. So this is a diagram of an oat plant, and you can see that relative to the height of the shoot, the depth of the roots is dramatically deeper. Another function of roots is to absorb nutrients. So gathering soil minerals is important. This diagram simply shows a soil particle, and attached to it are several different kinds of ions, such as potassium, calcium, and magnesium. These ions get released from soil particles and dissolve into the water, and then when the plant takes in water, it is able to take in these nutrients as well. Another function of roots is for storage, and so here's an example of horseradish, and you can see that horseradish roots are large and full of energy. A fifth function of roots we'll mention is that they exchange nutrients with fungi or bacteria. And we will talk about these nutrient exchanges later in the semester. In this photograph, what you see is a root that looks brownish or orangish, and then at the end of several root tips, you see this white encasing structure. That is actually a fungus, and the fungus is giving the plant some nutrients. In exchange, the fungus is getting sugar. We are going to switch gears here and talk about root structures. And we are going to do that by looking at one individual root, starting at the furthest point away from the plant, at the root cap, and then working our way upwards towards the plant. Remember that because this is growing downwards, this is the part that is furthest away from the plant. So this is the apex where the root cap occurs. And then up here at the top is actually basal with respect to the plant as a whole. So when we talked about stems, we said that elongation of stems occurs at the tips. That same thing is true in roots. So in this diagram, all of the new growth is going to occur down here, actually not quite at the root cap, but just above it in this region. And then just above that region, we're going to see that cells elongate. What this means is that most of this root is never going to move. This is going to be stationary in the soil, and it's only the tip of the root that is going to be moved, As these cells elongate and as new cells are added, this is going to get pushed downwards through the soil. This is important because it can be hard for a root to make it through soil because the soil particles impede movement. So the root cap are the cells that are on the very outside and tip of this structure. They do two things. They first protect the cells underneath from damage as this scrapes against soil particles. Second, they actually release a mucilaginous substance that lubricates the soil, and it makes it easier for the root to penetrate through. So now let's talk about this region slightly above. I said that new cells are made here. This in fact is an apical meristem. It's apical because it's near the apex of the root. And as we said for stems, meristematic tissue is tissue where new cells are added. So sometimes you'll see this abbreviated RAM for root apical meristem. New cells are made here, but they don't immediately get large. They initially stay small. The next region we'll talk about is slightly above that region, and this is the region of elongation. Here, not many new cells are made, but the cells that had been made in the apical meristem elongate. They can get several times longer than they were. And as we already alluded to, the effect of this elongation is that everything beneath this zone gets pushed downward. As we continue up the root, we see this hairy region. This is the region of maturation, and it's hairy because this is where the root grows root hairs. Root hairs are thin projections. They are cellular, so they are attached to the outside or epidermal cells, and they are very good at absorbing nutrients. Because they're very thin, they have a lot of opportunities to contact the soil or the water that is in that soil, and to absorb both the water as well as dissolved minerals. As we go up above this hairy region, we get to a region where there aren't any more root hairs, but we start to see these much wider lateral roots. So each root hair is just one part of one cell. The lateral roots are multicellular structures. And these lateral roots, we should specify, as time goes on, are going to get both longer and wider until they resemble the root from which they grew out. So a general rule in biology is that form follows function. This is a result of evolution. So when something has a function, then whichever form is better able to achieve that is going to be favored. We can see a few examples of that here. So one thing to look at is that the zone of maturation, this zone with root hairs, is above the zone of elongation. You could imagine it being the opposite. You could imagine the root hairs getting added down here and then getting pushed downwards as the region above it elongated. That doesn't happen for a good reason. Think about this root is sort of drawn on its own in space, but really it's surrounded by soil particles. So really there's going to be soil particles between and among these root hairs. If those root hairs were added down here beneath the zone of elongation, then as this region got pushed downwards in the soil, all of the root hairs would get sheared off. By instead adding them above this zone, this part of the root is never going to move, and so this is a safe region to have the root hairs. The next question is, why did the root hairs stop here instead of continuing up? We've already said this part of the root doesn't move, so there would be no problem with the root hairs getting sheared off. So to think about this, think about the temporal development. So in other words, what happens to this root over time? Right now the root tip is down here, but it grew and elongated to get here. So at some point in the past, that root cap was up here and even up here. That also means that at some point in the past, there used to be root hairs up at this level and this level and this level. Well, since root hairs absorb nutrients, think about the amount of nutrients that remain in the soil up at this upper part of the root. There's not going to be as much as down here where the root just arrived. So really the plant's allocation of root hairs to this region and its ability to get rid of the root hairs that used to be up in this region is an indication that it grows root hairs where there are the most nutrients, and it gives up on those hairs once the nutrients have been depleted. Next, we are going to look at lateral roots. I'm going to go back to that previous diagram to remind you lateral roots were growing up above the region of maturation. This is a root in cross-section, and all of these red-stained regions are the lateral roots. You can see that this is a different way of growing than lateral stems grew on a shoot. Remember, on the shoot there were axillary buds, and those axillary buds were on the very outside of the shoot, and those would start growing into new shoots. For lateral roots, we see something different. Those roots start growing inside the root, and as they grow, in fact we can see a younger one over here and over here, they start off inside, and then eventually they grow to a point where they reach the edge of the root, and they puncture the edge of the root and they grow through it, and then they continue growing outward and developing into new lateral roots. Lateral roots are important because they allow the plant to look for regions of high nutrients in the soil. So again, we're looking at a root that's been sliced here, and we're looking at it in cross-section. Maybe the top is coming towards us and the root tip is somewhere beneath this. You can imagine that the soil on this side of the root has more nutrients than the soil on this side of the root. If that's the case, then these lateral roots that are growing into this region of high nutrients are going to do better, they're going to get more resources from the plant, and they're going to have more opportunity for growth than those lateral roots that are growing perhaps over in this region. So by using lateral roots rather than just indefinitely extending the main root, the plant is able to explore a greater area with its roots and find areas with high nutrients. While we're talking about roots, let's think a little bit about how knowledge of roots is important for somebody who is growing houseplants or gardening. So first, let's consider transplants. And what's pictured here are several small coleus plants that will be used in the laboratory portion of this course. And when they are initially planted, they are going to have underdeveloped root systems. So immediately after transplanting, because the roots are not well developed, and specifically because the root hairs have not yet had time to reestablish, it's important to keep plants in a shady environment, a humid environment, and well watered. So this plastic lid is called a humidity dome, and it keeps a more humid environment inside than outside. That then means that the plant is losing less water, and there's less pressure on the few root hairs that are available to supply water to the rest of the plant. It's also important to remember that even if it's an old plant, if the plant needs to get transplanted for some reason, then many of those root hairs are going to break off. So immediately after transplanting, then the plant should be treated very carefully in these conditions. Next, as gardeners, let's think about what we would have to do for potted plants. Many of us have potted plants at home, and I think you've seen me with some of my potted plants in the previous lecture. So they are easy to ignore. You sort of put them by a window, you water them once or twice a week, maybe fertilize, and otherwise forget about them. Eventually, though, you'll see that the plants start to grow less and less, and then even start to die back and might eventually die. There's many reasons for that, but here's one particularly likely reason. Plants can become root-bound. What root-bound means is they are literally bound up by their own roots. This is a spider plant, and it's not in the pot right now. These are its roots, and you can see that they have fully covered the surface of where the pot used to be prior to removal. This is a problem because as the roots grow more and more, they compact the soil more and more. And as the soil is compacted, first it's harder and harder for the roots to penetrate through it. We've talked about that already. Second, because there are fewer spaces in the soil, that soil is going to be less able to hold water and less able to hold air. And both air and water are essential for the roots to continue growing and for the roots to supply water to the rest of the plant. So what we would do in this situation is at some point remove the plant from its pot and literally cut off many of these roots. We might remove half the root system. We would add new potting medium, which is similar to soil. It's what you would buy in a bag in the houseplant section of a hardware store. And then we might also remove some of the shoot material, because if we remove roots, there might not be enough shoots left to maintain, or rather, if we remove roots, there might not be enough roots left to maintain all of the shoots. So we would cut back the roots, we would cut back the shoots, add some more soil, not compact it, and put it back in the pot, and then we would get better growth for that plant. We will switch gears here and talk about some different forms of root systems. There are two main kinds of root systems. The first is a taproot system, the second is a fibrous root system. In a taproot system, then the first root the plant ever makes, and this is when it is just emerging from its seed, that initial root survives and becomes the main root of the plant. Lateral roots then form off of it. And so a carrot is the poster child, in this case it's literally on the poster, of a taproot system. The carrot itself is the initial root that formed, and then these lateral roots are smaller and growing off of it. The alternative kind of a root system is a fibrous root system, and we see this especially in things that are grasses or related to grasses. So corn and bamboo are both technically grasses, and then lawn grass as well as things like onions. In a fibrous root system, that initial embryonic root doesn't survive very long. Pretty quickly it dies. Once it dies, the plant needs some new roots, and so it grows roots. Instead of from its initial root system, it grows them from the bases of its shoots. And so these roots are going to be called adventitious roots. Adventitious roots are ones that do not grow from the original root system. Since there's no one central root, all of these adventitious roots are sort of co-equal and achieve a similar size. And so we get many roots that are all similar in size in the fibrous root system. In a taproot system, we get a main root. And you can quiz yourself here, but I think it's pretty straightforward. I think this is a radish, and in this case we have a taproot with just a few lateral roots, and then this is an onion, and again we have a fibrous root system. So that ends the root-focused portion of this lecture. The next category of things we're going to talk about are modified shoots. And modified shoots are going to be things that are technically shoots. They're made from stems and leaves, but they're doing things differently than just photosynthesizing. I think that all of the ones we're going to talk about serve some sort of storage function. The first one we'll talk about are bulbs. And bulbs are modified shoots that have fleshy storage leaves. This is exemplified by onions, but it also applies to garlic, and then some flowers that we might grow in our yards or sometimes as houseplants, like tulips and amaryllis. So you can see in these cut up onions very clearly these layers. Each of these layers is actually a round leaf, and then there are maybe a dozen round leaves in this particular onion. And then you can see an onion cut the other way here, and again you can see that these are leaves. They attach to a very short stem. The stem is right at the base of the onion, and it's a part that you would cut off before cooking the remainder. And then each leaf comes up, it forms part of this storage unit, and then it would continue out the top here and actually turn green, and that would be the photosynthetic portion of the leaf up here. These are going to be filled with some sort of carbohydrate, usually a sugar, and so we eat them for that sugar, but the plant is storing that sugar so it can either make flowers and seeds, or so that it can make new bulbs that would then be the source of new plants the next year. Another kind of modified shoot is a tuber. Tubers are subterranean storage shoots. And I say shoots here, but really I should say stems. So a tuber is a modified stem. And we can see that in this illustration of a potato. One way we can see it is the eyes, which are here and here and here, etc. You can see that these are not just randomly distributed around the potato. Instead, they follow a pattern. So the pattern is approximately helical. There's one here, then we wrap around the back of the potato, and then we get another row here, we wrap around the back, and we get another row here. That's important because this arrangement is reminiscent to how axillary buds would be distributed on an alternate branch. So this arrangement suggests that really what we're looking at here are nodes, where the eyes are, and then internodes, spaces between the eyes. We can also see that there are axillary buds, and one way to test that these are axillary buds is by taking a potato and planting it, and you'll see that in fact these eyes do eventually grow into new stems. If you just buy a potato from the supermarket, it might not work well because chemicals are applied to them to inhibit the axillary buds from growing into stems, because people don't like to buy them when that happens. So here's an example of what you can do with a potato. Take it, slice it into about 2-inch pieces, usually leave about 2 eyes on each piece, and just leave it sitting out for a few days for the wound to heal over. Once you've done that, you can take your piece of potato and plant it in soil, let's say out in the garden, with the eyes towards the top and the cut end towards the bottom, and these will grow into leafy stems. They will provide energy, and you can grow yourself a crop of potatoes. Another example of tubers is the Jerusalem artichoke, and you should have seen a video that showed Jerusalem artichokes growing in my yard just before this lecture. So here's a picture of the flowers. You can see that they are related to sunflowers. Here's a Jerusalem artichoke up close, and this picture is here so you can see how large they are. These are in the large size, but they can be the size of the palm of your hand. And these would be cooked much like potatoes. They can be baked or boiled or even pan-fried. We're going to move on now to another category of modified shoots, and these are rhizomes. So rhizomes are horizontal underground storage shoots. Tubers were also storage shoots, but the difference here is that rhizomes tend to be elongate, while tubers tend to be relatively short and squat. So they have two functions. Rhizomes are used for storage, as we've mentioned, but the fact that they're horizontal and somewhat elongate also allows plants to spread. And you should have seen an example of that with the asparagus that I talked about. So asparagus is one example, and in fact, these are rhizomes from asparagus right here. Ginger also grows in this way, as does bamboo and turmeric, which grows in a way it looks very much like a ginger root. So here's a picture of an asparagus plant, but you should have seen the video of an actual plant earlier. Here's an example of turmeric. Again, we've said all of this, but first I want you to see that turmeric is an attractive plant. You should be able to grow it as a house plant here in South Carolina, or possibly even as a garden plant if you bring it inside for the winters. And we often buy turmeric in powdered form, but this is what it looks like before it is dried and powdered. It looks very much like a ginger, what we call ginger root. But really we shouldn't call ginger root a root because it's actually a rhizome. Remember that this is stem, not root tissue. So we've talked about three kinds of modified shoots. We talked about bulbs, we talked about tubers, and we talked about rhizomes. Another modified stem is a stolon. A stolon does something similar to a rhizome in that it helps a plant spread. However, it's not used for storage, and so stolons tend to be thin. And in the previous video, you should have seen strawberry plants with stolons. Here's another example of strawberry, and you can see that they are connected by these thin above ground stems. Because their main function is not photosynthesis, they're not leaf covered. They pretty much go from one plant to the next plant that is being established. So make sure you know among those which ones are modified leaves and which ones are modified stems. And remember that all four of those categories we've just talked about are all shoots rather than roots. We're going to contrast that with actual storage roots. So tubers, rhizomes, and stolons are modified shoots. And what am I missing from this list? Oh, also bulbs. Roots, though, can have a storage function. And examples of storage roots include carrots, turnips, beets, and sweet potato. You might be confused because we talked about potato as being a tuber, but sweet potatoes and potatoes are not actually closely related to each other. They just have a similar form. So this picture shows sweet potatoes. And notice that in the sweet potatoes, these little holes going up them don't really look like the eyes of a potato. First, you can see that they've got roots growing out, but they don't have axillary buds. Second, you can see they aren't arranged in a helical pattern around the unit. Rather, they kind of go in straight lines. So that's a couple of clues that what we're looking at here is a true root rather than a modified stem. And I think I'll get questions about this, so I do want to just clarify here that tubers, rhizomes, and stolons are all examples of modified stems. The bulb is the one that is really the modified leaves. Because stems and leaves are both part of the shoot system, all four of those would be modified shoots. For tendrils and succulents, I'm not going to say much about them here. Your book talks about it talks about tendrils. With regard to that, the book tells you from what structures are tendrils modified and also what do tendrils accomplish. With regard to succulents, your book talks about that for a few paragraphs. So you should know examples of what kinds of organs have been modified to become succulent on succulent plants, and what is the function of being a succulent. So why has selection led to plants being succulent? And your book talks about whether this being succulent has evolved once or evolved repeatedly. I will end with some final thoughts. First, root systems and shoot systems are separate, however they are also interdependent. So remember that roots are providing water and nutrients to shoots. Shoots are providing energy reserves in the form of carbohydrates to roots. And we will talk later in the semester about how these two systems communicate and share materials with one another. Second, we have talked a fair amount about different ways of achieving subterranean storage, things like rhizomes, bulbs, tubers, etc. So there are many ways of doing this. I will also point out that we have many different kinds of subterranean storage crops. So things like onions, potatoes, beets, rutabaga, carrots, parsnips, etc. The variety of these indicates something about how important they were, especially historically. Back before we could transport food from areas where it was in the growing season to areas where it was outside of it, and back before we could freeze food during the growing season for the winter months, then it would have been important to be able to grow these crops and then store them for long periods such that we would have a source of fresh vegetables in the winter. The final set of thoughts relates to the idea that selection for similar traits can lead to evolutionary convergence. So one case of this is that structures like rhizomes and stolons have both evolved independently in many groups. The fact that they've evolved independently, even in unrelated plant lines, means that there is something useful about having rhizomes or stolons, such that evolution has led to these same structures being selected for repeatedly. Additionally, the fact that storage roots and storage shoots, like tubers, have similar shapes and functions, even though they evolved from different plant parts, suggests that there has been strong selection on plants to be able to store nutrients below ground.